coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
So they're coming, and party bigwigs can say all that they like about our sacred democracy and our shared values, but all of that rhetoric is being rapidly eaten away from underneath by rising generations who, they lack the competence, they lack the integrity, they lack the respect for our form of government, they lack the respect for our long-held common American mores. They're not particularly intelligent. They don't particularly have a wealth of relevant life experience. In almost all cases, they have vanishingly little experience in local or even state government. It's very bad. And we're beginning to see the consequences of that shift. I mean, some of the things that came out of their mouths, which were not in that supercut, you are not a whistleblower. There is no law that protects you. I mean, really scandalous stuff, not just erroneous, but this is the kind of thing that should make people genuinely concerned about how they are going to be governed. You think that the development of Chat GPT is giving you whiplash? Just wait until some of this generational turnover on the left completes itself.
Hello, and welcome to the Roundtable, the editor's podcast of The American Mind. I'm your host for today, Seth Barron, managing editor of The American Mind. I'm joined by James Polis, the editor of The American Mind. James, welcome to the Roundtable.
Seth, how goes it? It
goes great. Well, just to jump in, one of the biggest things that happened in the last week has been the meltdown, the second largest bank failure in American history, apparently, of Silicon Valley Bank, otherwise known as SVB. This is a commercial lending bank from Silicon Valley that I gather had become rather famous and well known in the tech industry as the lender and also the depository for many startups and larger firms. Starting on Friday, there was basically what sounded like a classic run on the bank. It's not clear entirely at this point who started it, but evidently the run on the bank was rooted. It's a strange one because unlike during the mortgage crisis when we had all these banks that had taken out very strange, risky investments, say in dodgy mortgages, this bank collapse involved the safest investments anyone could possibly make. The bank flooded, I gather, here's my understanding of it, is that the economy has been so flooded with cash that startups haven't really needed to go and borrow money from banks like the Silicon Valley Bank because, investors have had enough just to invest directly. So holding all this cash, the Silicon Valley Bank decided to just put it into treasuries, U.S. Treasury bills or notes, which don't pay a lot of interest, but, that's fine. So say they were getting 2% or 1.5% interest. But then as interest rates have gone up, they've been having to pay more interest to their depositors, and they basically weren't getting enough. They were paying more than they were getting on their own holdings, so they had to sell a lot of their bonds at a loss. There was a credit crunch, and people learned about this, and everybody rushed to take their money out, and the bank collapsed. James, what's your take on the whole story?
Well, I think that this is a multi-layered cake here, and as of now, it appears that this thing has been tied off. Some other banks were rapidly moved into the crosshairs. Signature Bank, First Republic stocks took a huge nosedive. Some trading was halted. First Republic was unhalted. And I think that there is a strong motivation at the Fed and in the halls of power to prevent this thing from spiraling because of the geopolitical environment. It's not 2008 again geopolitically, even though the surge was in there. There was really no prospect of great power war, great power conflict. The U.S. didn't really have that kind of rivalry going on. And now, with Ukraine trundling along, requiring vast sums to hold up the current policy, and with concern pivoting a bit to Taiwan, different factions in the government sort of fighting over which is the bigger priority. I think there is a real unwillingness to run any kind of risk financially and in the banking sector specifically, because the fundamentals aren't that great, and it only takes one shove for things to really spiral out of control of even the Fed, even DC itself. So all that said, things that have been bubbling below the surface for a long time came into play. Silicon Valley Bank, whether it's the role that Sequoia has played in China, concerns over the degree to which what was in effect money laundering was taking place, moving money out of China into the U.S., concerns about the ways that certain founders were able to architect arrangements with banks where they reduced their risk as people who wanted to be able to to cash out or to activate their equity option before the usual period. Kind of some arcane financial stuff, but I think basically what was bubbling below the surface at the domestic level was founders wanting to have as advantageous of a setup financially as they could, and finding a bank that was willing and able to deliver that for them. That's kind of something that's easy to understand what the motivations are and why they are. But yeah, it does create a certain different kind of risk. And I think it was Byrne Hobart at the Diff who first started writing explicitly about this in a way that caught a lot of people's attention, at least people, relatively in the know in the industry. He's got a pretty powerful tech newsletter. And so the beginnings of this contagion, really, as far as I can tell, arose from, him surfacing these issues, influential folks in VC and in the founder community sort of realizing that maybe this was an issue, and then things radiating from there through social media. Now, the role of social media itself is kind of interesting to look at there, because this is kind of the first time that we've seen a social media bank run. And that was really on display, not even just with Silicon Valley Bank, but when word started to spread, the memes started to spread that First Republic is next, First Republic is next. And you go back and you look through the trail of breadcrumbs on the Twitter timeline, and it was really like, one or two videos of some lines around the block at the First Republic branch in Brentwood in LA, just kind of tearing up Twitter. And you're looking at these things going like, okay, well, video doesn't look great, but there's one. First Republic is a small bank, relatively speaking, but a national bank. It's got a big presence on the East Coast as well as the West Coast. And so how little content is actually driving the frenzy, and how much of it is just kind of social media doing what it does, which is in making people spread information more or less involuntarily. They feel like they have to, or they're just kind of caught up in the wave. So, a viral bank run, that's something that the system hasn't really had to deal with before. And in spite of the fact that there's all kinds of corruption and shenanigans and perverse incentives and bad guys floating around in the way our financial system has been structured and what designs our government has on using finance to control people still more, I think it's pretty safe to say that we should all be relieved or even glad that things are being tied off in this way, and that depositors are going to be made whole.
Yeah, I mean, certainly just from the perspective of not wanting a collapse of the financial system. Let me ask you, I thought it was very interesting to see not just a difference between the parties in formulating a response, But clearly, there was a major division among the Democrats themselves as to how the response should be structured. On Friday, Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen came out and very, firmly said, no, there will be no bailout. There will be no, I mean, it even sounded like she was saying there will be no backstopping of deposits, beyond what the FDIC ensures, which sounded pretty scary. And then you had people like Elizabeth Warren saying that this was, a problem with bank deregulation and that it was Trump's fault somehow, going back to Dodd-Frank and all of that. But then on Monday, Biden came out and said, oh, no, the depositors were going to be okay. Evidently, Gavin Newsom, he has major accounts at Silicon Valley Bank, apparently, but he was very upset. And I gather like a lot of the Democrats' donors are, tech people in California. I assume they probably got involved in calling in and saying, hey, you better do something here. And then, speaking of the whole social media aspect, I heard that Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, at a meeting had asked, well, can't we just censor social media so nobody can spread information about banking, about, bank failures, so we can prevent that? What do you make of like the dissension within the Democrats' ranks? Like, what does this say? We've got like the Bernie, Liz Warren people on one side who I gather think that agree with the Republicans that, well, if depositors if they lose their money, that's too bad. Shareholders, they lose their equity, that's too bad. And then this kind of more crony capitalist centrist wing of the Democrats, like the Newsoms and whatnot, who really favored, no, we have to, like, as you say, tie everything off. What do you think's going on?
Yeah, I mean, there are these serious cleavages in the Democratic Party right now and on the left. And I think you see those struggles kind of reverberating through foreign policy, financial policy, some of them popping up here. There was a picture of Elon Musk and Gavin Newsom that was making the rounds roughly during this time. People needing to signal, tech people wanting to signal that they are not an enemy of the feds. And then Democrats in Washington wanting to signal sometimes to their constituents that, the techies are the bad guys. But then you look under the surface and it's like, well, a lot of these guys actually realize that they're kind of dependent on the techies in order to flex the kind of power that they have available to them as more and more of governance is technologized. And it's a delicate dance. So when you mention this call to like, well, hey, can't we just shut these people up if they're spreading information that, if it's just one video and it takes down the entire system, then like, that seems to be bad. And it does seem to be bad, but it also seems to be a case of like, well, who do you actually trust to press the button on this stuff? Do you trust the people who want to have access to your banking information if you transfer more than $600 to someone on the internet? Like there's a trust gap there, and it's going to be difficult to fill. So, in the abstract, gosh, wouldn't it be good if we could just halt the memes in the same way that we halt trading if things seem like they're about to trip into the abyss? Like, well, yes, abstractly, that does sound like something that might be helpful. But then in reality, you go, well, okay, so who do you trust to be responsible enough to govern in a way that, doesn't just resonate with our quote unquote, our values, which, it's an open question what that even means right now. But, to just practically make the right kind of decisions and be judicious in it. I was reading this morning an interview Fast Company did with Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO, who seems to just be very thirsty for governance style power. He doesn't seem to be content to just do the sort of yachting circuit with the bimbos. So he put out this video on artificial intelligence. He's obviously saying this is going to change everything, and you should listen to me, and I'm sort of an honest broker. And I think a lot of people are looking for that kind of honest broker. And Elon is trying to sort of position himself that way, and Eric Schmidt and some others. But there was a passage here that stuck out to me when I was reading it, and it sticks out all the more now that we are having this conversation. And it goes like this. Fast Company says, there's a part in the video where he's discussing how AI systems should be governed. And this is just quoting FC. And you point out that this should be done with input from a wide range of people and organizations. But you also make clear that you believe AI systems should be based on our Western values and consistent with our democratic principles. I wondered, says the interviewer, about that statement because the governance problems we've been discussing here are not just Western-centric problems, but global problems. Okay, and so here is Eric Schmidt's response. When I say Western values, I'm referring to individual values of thought, free speech, the ability to peaceful protests, those kinds of things. It's the stuff we all grew up with. I'm taking the position that democracies are fragile and that it's relatively easy to destroy a democracy with a demagogue. And there's lots of historical examples of this. And I'm further taking the position that these are tools, AI tools, which in the hands of a demagogue could be used to really harm democracies. That's my personal belief. Autocracies will use this stuff very differently. They'll use this to convince their citizens of the corporate view or the government view. That's not how democracies work. And I don't know how to influence the autocracy's behavior, although you can be sure that they're all going to shut down a whole bunch of dissent with this stuff, unquote. Okay, and so, he's saying things that would make a lot of intuitive sense to a lot of the people he grew up with. And, there is this kind of sort of normie default that says like, well, hey, this is America and the West is good and we have these values and, none of this stuff should be up for debate. It's, we're a democracy. Democracy is good. The historical progress of our civilization is good. And, technology should just align with that. And by the same token, the normie belief is like, well, autocracies, those are the bad guys. Those guys don't share our values. And so we need to make sure that, whatever technology does to us, it doesn't turn us into the bad guys. And once again, in the abstract, that all seems very reasonable. In reality, you read Eric Schmidt here, and this guy's positioning himself as someone who should basically be looked to lead America and the West in technologizing life itself. And he's just doesn't acknowledge even a little bit that the current regime that loves to speak so fondly of our sacred democracy and our Western values and on and on and on is behaving exactly like an autocracy in all the ways that we talk about week in and week out on the podcast and day in and day out on The American Mind. I mean, there isn't even a nod in that direction. Whether it's sort of like, well, maybe some of these wokies have taken things a little too far, or, well, maybe our government really has gotten to a point where, it can be invasive and it can cross some lines. And, we saw like what kinds of things that happened in Australia and Canada with pandemic and these crackdowns. And maybe that's not so good. And maybe that's important to talk about when thinking through the technologization of governments through things like AI and so forth. And he just doesn't even say a thing about that. And so, you've got these senators who are trying to play catch up and they don't really understand. I forgot which senator it was who was during one of those hearings, I don't really understand what a Substack is. And it's like, this isn't very promising. So you got elected officials who are just falling behind. You've got officials who are not elected, who are flexing as hard as they can to use whatever technology they can to pay lip service to quote unquote our values, and then to govern in an incredibly autocratic way with no end in sight. And then you've got guys like Eric Schmidt who are coming out of tech who present themselves as being very responsible, very expert, very learned. You can trust that they understand these technologies inside and out. You can look to them for guidance, and just an absurd naivety, if that's what it is, about this gap between the rhetoric of democracy and the practice of, a post-liberal left autocracy. So none of this looks great, and it's just very difficult to find someone who does pass that trust test, that smell test, for someone who can step to the fore and seriously lead, not just on technology, but on governance as well. I think it's a jump ball. I think Americans are hungry and looking for that person. And given what it is that we've just gone over, I think many Americans are really hoping that someone on the right can step up and distinguish themselves, and it's going to be a jump ball there too. It looks like so many more miles left to run here before we get to 24. But I think the stakes are really coming into focus.
Let me just ask you, we don't have to spend too much time on Silicon Valley Bank, but there was some amusing information that came out. People were saying that, their risk management, facilities clearly fell down on the job, that they should have been more attuned to what was going on. And I gather their chief risk manager, her biography said, well, she's a queer woman of color and she grew up working class and maybe the child of immigrants, and that she seemed it seemed as though her whole mission was less about, managing financial risk in a bank and more about, kind of woke DEI type of, soft sort of human resources concerns. And then the board of the bank doesn't really seem to have that many people with banking experience on it, that they all seem to be essentially politically connected, like, primarily from the Clinton campaign and, these sorts of people. Someone who's like an improv artist, like a comedian. I know this is kind of not related precisely to what you were talking about before, but to what extent do you think this kind of, the loading up of, bureaucratic bloat, the emphasis on, politically connected personnel, DEI type stuff, do you think that might have played much of a part in this, or is that kind of like, maybe a stretch?
Well, it certainly plays a role, and it is a systemic role. I mean, these little companies within a company are everywhere now, and the relentless conformity and policing involved in ensuring that every single institution of any significance and wealth and power in American life is terraformed into a DEI human resources franchise. This cannot be ignored, and the role that it plays in reducing competence as a criterion of excellence is profound. There's a lot of talk on the tech side of media and the discourse right now about how AI, or whatever you want to call that. I would really question the use of the term artificial intelligence to describe these things, but that's maybe a story for another day. But a lot of the tech conversation is like this progress, breakneck advancement of AI is really great because it reveals that bureaucracy sucks, that bureaucracies are bad, that they're bloated, that they're incompetent, and that they're a bad way of organizing society and organizing economic enterprise. And, this is further proof that at a time when major institutions are all wokeifying themselves, really they're just sort of, churning out this ritualistic gibberish. And meanwhile, you can just ask any chat client to execute competently whatever order you give it, and it'll do so with a minimum of the gibberish, even though there are allegations that the chat is woke or biased or whatever. Nevertheless, if you just make sure that the programmers are legit, then these things are going to be able to outperform major corporations, outperform attorneys, outperform advisors, outperform analysts. And that seems to be accurate on its face. Maybe it's like it's now quite a low bar that a chat client can score better on an SAT exam than an extremely online woke high schooler or whatever. Maybe that's a low bar now. But there are issues. And I think one of the issues here is that it's really a mistake to set up this kind of conceptual dichotomy between centralized bureaucracy on the one hand and decentralized kind of open source anarchy on the other. Yes, it's true that experience suggests that if you have a kind of open marketplace like environment where people can just put their hands on tools and use them to strengthen themselves and one another, that you get more or less better results in human flourishing than you get if you have one sort of sclerotic centralized source of power trying to conform people to its dictates, however off base or recondite they might be. At the same time, I think history and experience also shows that all too often what appears to be an open source sea of anarchy is really just a kind of swarm that powerful officials and institutions use as kind of a petri dish or a farm league where they can spot talent, where they can learn about how to manipulate groups in society, and then they just hoover up the talent that rises to the top of that kind of experiment, or they bribe the most ambitious and intelligent people who bubble up to the surface to just kind of absent themselves from conflict over what the entrenched interests are doing. I think you see that all over the place, and you don't have to be super conspiratorial to see it. I mean, if you just look at kind of the origins of contemporary art movements in post-Cold War Europe, like where did they come from? Why did they develop in the way that they did? How did various ideological and cultural commitments come to take dominance in that scene and spread from there throughout civil society? Well, a lot of those organizations, from the very beginning were basically just Soros-funded groups. Communism falls. What are you going to do? Soros money comes in. What do? They buy galleries. They host gallery exhibitions. They support, starving artists, and you build from there. And in a couple generations, you've orchestrated pretty wide-scale social and cultural change with dramatic political implications. And that's just one example. So, the powers that be have gotten pretty well educated about how to create these spaces that seem to be just kind of like a breeding ground for creativity or for, cults or for plucky upstarts or scenes or progressive movements that on the surface appear to be unguided and organic, but in reality are being nourished with money by people with a clear agenda who just want to make sure that, they're in as much control of a fairly chaotic situation as they can be. And I don't think that's going to end anytime soon. And I think techies are being naive or are willing to sound naive if they keep trying to get people to think like we are the alternative to bureaucracy because we are for everyone just kind of having a free-for-all and using these tools to optimize their lives. Would that it were so simple.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, sometimes I think of, it seems to me like one of the reasons why the US is failing now, I mean, assuming it is, or at least hampering itself or hobbling itself, is because equity determinations are already so baked into everything that effectively it's like, I don't know, like a kind of a tribute or tax that has to be paid upfront on all expected earnings and all high. So essentially everything has to be, it's like a cost plus type thing in contracting. Okay, yes, you want to set up an enterprise. All right, just make sure that the first 15% of the first dollar goes to hiring, this whole human resources department that's going to be, pushing DEI up and down the organization. The same way that like when a big city like New York does contracting, okay, well, we have to take into consideration, like basically no development can get built unless, you take into account, well, we have to provide housing for the very poor, what is the affordability quotient? So essentially you have this built-in inefficiency, which almost becomes like the purpose of doing things. It's almost like you have to, well, we like everything becomes a jobs program for HR in a sense. There's like this old joke where, I don't know if it's true, but Milton Friedman talks about going to China in like the 70s, and he sees they're digging something, like all these people with shovels, and he's like, well, why don't you just use you have bulldozers and steam shovels, why don't you just use those? And they were like, well, this is a jobs program. And he's like, well, why don't you just have them use spoons? That way you'd have a lot more, you could employ a lot more people. I kind of feel like that sort of attitude defines the American approach to doing things. So I think you're totally right. Like, you've got this drive towards efficiency on one hand, like, oh, we could have driverless cars moving everything around, and all we have to do is figure out how people are going to entertain themselves with no work. And then at the same time, you've got like all of this like make work to impose this diversity agenda. Well, that was a lot of time spent on SVP, and I think we kind of drifted, but leads me into the next topic, which I thought is related, actually, which was the hearing last week for the new House Committee on Weaponization of the Federal Government, which was really interesting. And they had a few of the journalists from the Twitter files. They had Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger, both of whom are excellent journalists and writers, both of whom, from what I gather, are essentially men of the left. But they were called forward to talk about the Twitter files. And it was just the most fascinating. I don't know how many of you have seen these clips of it, but I mean, it was just bizarre. James, did you catch any of this?
Well, as is my wont, I guess I spent more time monitoring it on socials than I did just cracking open a Snapple and sitting back and watching the TV.
Well, sure.
But yeah, and it has been interesting. I mean, there's no doubt that some of these guys who were more or less straight down the middle lefties of some kind have, I think, been pushed away from that territory. And we've talked about this a little bit before, where if you wanted to get good full-throated criticism of corporatism in America circa 2010, you kind of had to go to the left for it. If you wanted like an actual acknowledgement that maybe like the Western intelligence agencies, including America's intelligence agencies, had far exceeded their rightful power and authority and were beginning to work against the primal interests of the American people, you kind of had to go to the left for that.
From about like 1919 until I would say 2015, you had to go to the left to get that kind of analysis of the FBI, the CIA, and the intelligence community, and then it completely switched.
And it did switch, and I think there's at least one book that ought to be written on exactly why it switched like that and how it switched. But switch it did, and all to the good as far as I'm concerned. But for a guy like Taibbi, he became, I think, kind of initially famous as the vampire squid guy who was the second coming of Hunter Thompson, and wrote in Rolling Stone about how these horrible, financial industry types sucked America dry during the financial crisis. And now he's over here. And I was a little bit surprised that he was actually called before Congress, but I thought, it's about time that we have these conversations at that level.
Well, let me interrupt you because we have a little clip. The way the Democrats attacked Taibbi and Schellenberger, I've never ever seen anything like this in Congress before, in terms of treating the witness with such derision and hostility. Blaze, can you play that clip? It's very interesting.
Republicans have brought in two of Elon Musk's public scribes before you became Elon Musk's hand-picked journalists, these so-called journalists. Now, You crossed that line with the Twitter files.
No.
Elon Musk, it's my time. Please do not interrupt me.
A balancing test
Okay.
between the public
Reclaiming my
interest.
time. Thank you very much.
Reclaiming my time.
Sure.
Gentleman's out of order.
Patently obvious answer. Reclaiming my time.
I want to reclaim my time.
Reclaiming my time. This is how it works now. I'll ask the questions and you try to provide an answer if you can.
No, I don't agree.
Excuse me, it's my time, thank you.
That if we can take off the tinfoil hat.
Being a Republican witness today certainly casts a cloud over your objectivity. Two witnesses who pose a direct threat to people who oppose them.
I understand you like to filibuster. That was not an answer to my question.
Congressman,
And
may
it
I
should
ask
be a
a question?
bipartisan goal. No, you don't get to ask questions here.
So I didn't
they
ask
didn't
a
ask
question. I didn't ask you a question, sir.
I'm not asking you a question. I'll let you know when I do.
This was basically like, okay, that's obviously compressed, but obviously the Democrats, and here's something interesting I noticed. I didn't recognize very many of these Democratic representatives on this committee. The ranking member is not even a congresswoman. She's like a delegate from the Virgin Islands, I think. Debbie Wasserman Schultz was famous, but she kind of lost power after the whole scandal with Hillary and Bernie, when she was head of the DNC. Most of these people seem like kind of real backbencher types, but they've clearly been primed and instructed as to just be as nasty as possible, insult the witnesses. I mean, saying that Schellenberger and Taibbi were witnesses who posed a threat. Obviously the Twitter files is like the Democrats hate this topic. What do you think about this, James? This is kind of an open-ended question, but what do you make of all this? What a weird response the Democrats put on.
Well, it's an absolute disgrace, and I'm sorry to say it is a glimpse into the future that is hurtling our way. You know, these are people who simply do not respect the values that their party makes such a big deal about supposedly standing for and upholding. These are people who look on American history as a litany of fundamental injustice perpetrated by people of a sort who, the faster they depart from this planet, the better off we will all be. They do not respect our institutions. They do not respect the founders of our government or our form of government. And this is becoming the rule among, younger generations that lean left. These are not, people who are going to cite Oliver Wendell Holmes in a debate. They're going to try to not have a debate at all, much less have any kind of inherited memory of the sorts of gentlemen who have been keeping the wheels on the wagon all this time. So they're coming, and party bigwigs can say all that they like about our sacred democracy and our shared values, but all of that rhetoric is being rapidly eaten away from underneath by rising generations who, they lack the competence, they lack the integrity, they lack the respect for our form of government, they lack the respect for our long-held common American mores. They're not particularly intelligent. They don't particularly have a wealth of relevant life experience. In almost all cases, they have vanishingly little experience in local or even state government. It's very bad. And we're beginning to see the consequences of that shift. Some of the things that came out of their mouths, which were not in that supercut, you are not a whistleblower. There is no law that protects you. Really scandalous stuff, not just erroneous, but this is the kind of thing that should make people genuinely concerned about how they are going to be governed. You think that the development of Chat GPT is giving you whiplash? Just wait until some of this generational turnover on the left completes itself, and then you're really going to get some whiplash.
I was fascinated by the way they all repeated this thing. As soon as Taibbi or Schellenberger started to answer a question, they would say, "Reclaiming my time." This phrase, I only first started hearing it a few years ago, but now I guess they're really into it. This sense of like righteous indignation, like how dare you try to seize my time? It was really bizarre. The funny thing is, look, I used to cover the New York City Council fairly carefully, and I would go and you would see these council members who are nobodies, and some member of the administration would be there, and the council members would just like fulminate and just really like rip into them and just say all this crazy stuff. But there was nothing behind it. It was just like this crazy noise. It sort of reminded me of that a bit, and I like the way Taby sort of just like was sort of chuckling and shaking his head, like he just kind of baffled by this strange like machine he'd entered. Like this one actually my congressman, this fellow Goldman, who was terrible. He kept talking about the the Mueller report, and do you deny the findings of the Mueller report? And he'd be like, well, they're just allegations. And he was like, that's an outrage. Yeah, it just seems so funny that all of the discredited nonsense of the Russiagate and all of that, everything, the Mueller report, the 18 intelligence community agencies that agree that Donald Trump is an agent of Putin. These congressmen, they just brought up every single discredited like element of the Steele report and demanded that Matt Taibbi, of all people, affirm it. And then when he would start to talk, they would yell at him and shut him up and cut him off and reclaim their time. It was the most perverse exercise I've seen in Congress. And that's basically all I've got to say about it. It just seemed like really weird.
Oh yeah, deeply weird. And these you have to sort of demonstrate your loyalty to the regime by uttering these oaths, and they just move on from one standard to the next as as these various operations that they attempt to conduct either manage to stagger on or don't. And if they can call people before Congress and harangue them in this way, who's next? Who are they going to do it to next? They're not going to stop here.
Well, just moving on to our final topic, maybe like a little bit lighter hearted. The Oscars were the other night. James, did you watch the Oscars?
Believe it or not, I did not watch the Oscars.
Guess what? I didn't.
I did see the clips though.
Okay, I saw clips too, and I had seen a few of the movies, but I didn't really actually. I did not see the movie that won everything, which was that Everything All the Time All at Once. I'm sorry, I'm mangling the name of the movie. Did you see that movie?
Everything, Everywhere, All at
Okay.
Once,
Yeah.
which I did not see, and I skipped it on purpose, not on accident. There's I mean, maybe we can get into it. I don't want to step on your intro here, but
Go ahead.
I have thoughts about this film.
Please.
And I was concerned that it would be one of those films where it would just be heralded as sort of the epitome of everything that anyone should care about ever, and that seems like what has happened. But this is just so. I guess it was 2 years ago at this point. Was it last year? It's all a blur. I did a little interview with Niccolo Soldo, who longtime listeners may be familiar with, whether from his Twitter account or from his Substack. And I will just read a little snippet of that interview, which struck me as relevant to this film. Tocqueville observes that in democratic times, quote, each individual becomes more like his fellows, weaker and smaller. The human mind seeks to embrace a multitude of objects at once, and it constantly strives to link up a variety of consequences with a single cause. The concept of unity becomes an obsession, unquote. What he says of the pantheist attitude that results applies to the social whole. Quote again, one may be sure that such a system, although it destroys human individuality, or rather just because it destroys it, will have secret charms for men living under democracies, unquote. So here comes this film about the metaverse and multiverses and multicultural and multi-gender expression and multisexual, and it's all of a piece. And Tocqueville identified some trends that seem to inhere in societies where the equality of conditions spreads and takes root in a deep way, a way that's deeper than just how much do you have in your bank account. And I think we're just reaping that harvest right now. We're just really getting started in earnest in becoming truly obsessed with unity and hungry for a spiritual experience that destroys what the aristocrats of the print era would consider to be the indivisible individuality of the human person.
There was a funny moment, I guess, on the red carpet that everybody was talking about as like just an example of egregious bad manners, where Hugh Grant was interviewed. Can we play that clip? It's short.
Hugh Grant, you are a veteran of the Oscars, and you've been here a few times. Yeah. What's your favorite thing about coming to the Oscars?
It's fascinating. The whole of humanity is here. It's Vanity Fair.
Oh, it's all about Vanity Fair. Yes, that's where we let loose and have a little bit of fun. What are you most excited to see tonight?
To see?
Yeah, well, I know that you probably watched a few of the movies. Are you excited to see anybody win? Do you have your hopes up for anyone?
No one in particular.
Okay, well, what are you wearing tonight then?
Just my suit.
Your suit? Who made your suit? You didn't make it.
I can't remember. My tailor.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Shout out to the tailor.
Yeah.
So tell me, what does it feel like to be in Glass Onion? It was such an amazing film. I really loved it. I love a thriller. How fun is it to shoot something like that?
Well, I'm barely in it. I'm in it for about 3 seconds.
Yeah, but still, you showed up and you had fun, right?
Almost.
Okay, all right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. It was nice to talk to you.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever. It's just this kind of amusing interest. I guess what's funny about it is that he's not really being a mouthpiece for like Hollywood PR and the whole charade, and he's just kind of like talking more or less like a normal person. When I heard about this interview, I heard he was just so blisteringly nasty. But then you listen to it, he wasn't really. I mean, he was just like answering questions sort of like a normal, like a regular human being. It seemed kind of funny to me that, and then, he talked about like Vanity Fair, and she reads it as like the magazine and the big party that they hold. It just seemed like an amusing kind of episode. And I like that everybody was like really on edge about it. Like, how dare he do this? James, do you have any thoughts on this, or is this just like
No. Many thoughts. I mean, you really see sort of like the last gasp of Great Britain in the bemused observances of Hugh Grant on the red carpet. I mean, it's, this is a guy who in living memory was notable for his like extremely tawdry public dalliances with marginal figures satisfying his sexual interests. And now he looks like, he looks like the right honorable gentleman in comparison to the gaggle of folks parading around him. It's almost as if, I mean, back in the 90s, it was commonplace for good-looking, intelligent, ambitious, creative people to voluntarily do a lot of drugs and try to make their way through the insanity of celebrity via the coping mechanism and the kind of psychological distancing effect that hopefully copious amounts of drugs would give you, rather than just sort of sending you into insanity. And many of them were willing to like walk that line in the hopes that on balance, the coping effect of the drugs would outweigh the self-alienating effect of the drugs. And what you see now in current year, 2023, is that actually the experience of like social insanity and like absurdity and arbitrariness and the kind of ridiculousness of the pantomime of things that you're supposed to do in contemporary life, that has all been generalized. It is no longer just like a problem that confronts like young, ambitious, good-looking, intelligent, rising elites. It is a problem that saturates everything and just defines social life as a whole, to the point where, you know, you turn on the Oscars and you watch it and you're like, what am I even looking at? Like, what planet is this broadcast coming from? It has become so far removed, even from what the Oscars itself once were. Society is remaking itself, and this is not all the product of just sort of, you know, malevolent elites pulling puppet strings. A lot of this is just like the character of the people is changing, and it's not changing for the better. Things are becoming, you know, more idiocratic and more crass and more shallow and more deranged and more empty and more lurid, and Stephen Colbert doing the vaccine dance bit. I mean, all of that kind of stuff. It's become incredibly surreal and really just hostile to like the human spirit in some fundamental way. And to see, you know, Hugh Grant giving off this vibe of like, well, yes, you know, if you want an intensely uncomfortable experience pushing the boundaries of sanity, you know, you could pick up like the tranny hooker at 3 a.m, like I once did. But have you tried normal life in 2023? Like, that's the real, you're really walking on the edge. You really have to sort of like bet on your ability to withstand the gauntlet just by showing up to an Oscar party is now subjecting you to an even greater derangement of the senses than being an A-lister in the 90s.
I do believe that when Hugh Grant was arrested for picking up Divine Brown, that Divine Brown was not a transsexual, but a cis woman. It was Eddie Murphy who was caught picking up a transsexual, though he claimed that, oh no, I was just giving her a ride.
That's right.
But whatever.
I regret the error.
No. It's fine. I mean, look, it's
this
all
is the
one,
fact
right?
checking that American gets.
It's all one. Well, let's move on to our final segment, which is the new but popular Read the Damn Site section of the podcast, where we just highlight a specific article that we think everyone should read. I'm going to exercise my prerogative as today's host to go first. I suggest that everyone should go and read our beloved Peachy Keenan's piece, Hick Libs on Parade, The Queering of the American Frontier. It's a brutal and some would say black-pilled takedown of the down market trend of the whole trans and queer phenomenon, which essentially enables, you know, it has kind of seeped into the hinterlands, let us say, and is making its mark there. And, you know, in her inimitable way, Peachy really skewers the pretensions to hipness and coolness of what are essentially like Walmart moms now dyeing their hair rainbow and claiming to be queer and I love my trans kid and so forth. It's a funny piece. I would check it out. James?
Funny, haha. Yes, no, it is funny as well as funny in the queer sense. Okay, so what will I say? I will say that Scott Yennor's piece, Making Wokeism Die, is worth your eye if you haven't seen it already. Ron DeSantis is, I guess, now becoming notorious for referring to Florida as the state where woke goes to die. And he is putting some muscle behind that claim in the education system, where he is going to bat against the spread of DEI in the state university system in Florida. And Scott gives a nice primer on that and where things are headed. We are, needless to say, enthusiasts of this trend and this policy, and we are supporters of it in any way that we can be. So we are glad to see this happening. We'd like to see more of it. We think that it is very likely going to be an effective template, which can be carried from Florida to other fertile ground throughout the nation. long overdue in some ways, but I guess it's just human nature that sometimes things have to get quite bad before the right kind of action can be taken to counteract. So Making Wokeism Die by Scott Yenor. Give it a look.
Thanks for tuning in today to this episode of The Roundtable. If you liked what you heard, why not subscribe? Why not leave us a 5-star review? Anything less than that, keep it to yourselves. I'd like to thank our production crew, Jake Gannon and Blaze Ebner. And till next time, signing off.